Good afternoon, and welcome to Invariance Dialogue for Change, supporting mental health in the workplace. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the event, please type them into the chat box. Invariance Dialogue for Change series facilitates conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for companies and members of the policy community interested in engaging on relevant cultural and business issues. I'm Caroline Ponsetti. I'm a communication strategist with Invariant Strategic Communications and Public Affairs practice. I've worked across all aspects of the DC communications world, from serving as a press secretary on Capitol Hill, leading media relations for the Gambling Industries Trade Association, and helping clients tell their stories as a communications consultant. I'm also a mental wellness advocate. I've experienced anxiety and depression for most of my adult life, and I'm open about my experience in part to show others that they're not alone and that mental health issues don't have to hold you back. I channel this personal passion into my work advising gambling companies and regularly write and speak about how the gambling industry should look to successes from the overall movement to destigmatize mental health as a roadmap to address and prevent gambling addiction. We're entering a new era for mental health. It's a topic that's been present in the mainstream conversation for the past decade, but COVID really put it on the radar. Gen Z and millennials are more comfortable talking about their mental health than ever before. Today, we'll explore how leaders and managers can promote mental wellness at work, what employees expect from employers regarding mental health benefits and resources, how to address the unique mental health challenges faced by minorities, and how to support all colleagues experiencing mental health challenges. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our two guest speakers who are experts in workplace wellness and mental health. Dr. Dennis Stoley is the Senior Director of Applied Psychology for the American Psychological Association, where he oversees applied psychology initiatives across a variety of subject areas, including workplace psychology. Dennis is also a licensed attorney. He's published widely on the application of psychological science to solve real-world problems and to promote psychological and emotional well-being in the workplace. He also frequently provides commentary for print and broadcast media. Amanda Miller Littlejohn is an executive coach for high achievers. An author and journalist, Amanda explores our relationship to work and ambition in the post-pandemic era. Her timely articles on rest and burnout have appeared in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, as well as in her regular column for Forbes. She's currently hard at work on her next book, The Rest Revolution, which is slated to be released in the fall of 2024. Now let's get started. We've recently seen a lot of positive change with public figures like Michael Phelps, Selena Gomez, Senator Fetterman speaking out about their mental health, and even senators launching the first bipartisan mental health caucus last year. But it hasn't always been this way. Let's start the conversation by discussing how the dialogue around mental health has changed and why that's so important. Dennis, I'd like to start by defining mental health. How should we be thinking about the term?
Well, I think that is a really good place to start because the conversation that's been happening in society around mental health has been growing, and that's a good thing. What it also means that the term mental health is getting used a lot, and it doesn't always get used in the same way by different people. So really kind of getting our arms around what we mean by the term mental health is useful. I like the definition that's provided by the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization provides a very expansive definition of mental health. They define it as being a state of mental well-being. So a state that allows people to be able to cope with the stress of life and to realize their abilities and to learn and to work and to contribute to their community. And so that's a very positive definition. And the World Health Organization points out that mental health exists along a continuum. It's not just the absence of mental disorders. So at one end of the continuum, you may have serious mental illness that is completely debilitating to an individual. At the other end of the continuum of mental health, you may have psychological flourishing. And then there are all kinds of states that happen in between. Myself, as a social and personality psychologist, I tend to focus more on those parts of the continuum that sort of range from coping or getting by psychologically all the way up to psychological thriving. Whereas many of my colleagues who are clinical in clinical practice tend to focus more on the debilitating kinds of mental disorders. But I think it's really important to just keep that full range of possibilities in mind when we talk about mental health.
Sure, that's helpful. Thank you. Great place to get us started. Amanda, I'm curious, what kind of verbiage are you using when you're talking with your clients or other people in this industry?
Well, we've been talking a lot about burnout as it relates to mental health. That's something that has popped up again and again in conversations with my clients who mostly are high achievers. So they're already used to working extremely hard, but the past few years have brought, I think, our culture of overwork more into focus, and we're starting to see the limitations of that and how it's just frankly not sustainable.
Mhm. The sustainability aspect is so true, and I'm glad you talk a little bit about this post-pandemic world because right now we just need to take a look at where we are holistically when it comes to mental health. How would both of you say the United States is doing when it comes to mental health, well-being generally, and then particularly in the workplace?
There's a lot to that question.
Yeah.
When you look at, take for example, the American Psychological Association, we do an annual survey called Stress in America. And we look generally at the mental health of Americans. And so it's a large sample survey, long survey that we have typically 1,500 or more people complete. And what we've seen in our 2023 data as compared to earlier years, so sort of pre-pandemic years, is an uptick in reports of stress and reports of stress resulting in mental health concerns. We see an uptick in the number of actual mental health diagnoses, and it's not the same across all groups. And so we see the uptick more with millennials and Gen Z, say, than in some of the older groups that respond to the poll. And we also see differences in terms of gender and race and type of occupation. All kinds of different factors can come into play. And so at a very broad level, I would say that the United States is not in a good spot right now. Things are worse. At the same time, though, it's a complicated picture. And so it's worse for some groups of people and not others. And so when some people hear that report, it may not ring true for them because they may be in a very good place right now. But when you kind of look at it on average across everybody and compare it across time, we're not in a really good spot right now. And you also asked about not just in general, but in the workplace. At APA, we also do an annual survey called Work in America. And we look at these same kinds of issues, but specific to the workplace. And there too, we're seeing similar patterns where people are really experiencing a lot of stress right now across both surveys. It can almost be interpreted as sort of a post-traumatic response at this point to the pandemic that we were all going through so recently. We also see some good things, though, happening in the workplace. There are many reports of employers communicating more about mental health issues, trying to offer more assistance in terms of mental health support. And so while there's a lot of downsliding in some sense, there's also some good things that we're seeing coming out of the data as well. Maybe one of the most troubling things, and Amanda has kind of already referred to this, is that I think that we are seeing now, much more than in the past, a lack of respect for time off. And it is this always on culture that we're in, where so many of us are carrying our workplace in the form of our smartphone in our front pocket and you just feel like you are on call all the time, and that wears on people.
Sure. And certainly something that I'd love for you to talk more about when we get into the your advice for coping and how employees can actually set those kinds of boundaries. Amanda, where would you say we are?
Well, I listening to you, Dennis, that was really interesting about the survey. And I wanted to add, in terms of us seeing more people that are reporting stress or reporting mental health challenges. In my work, in talking to professionals, especially professionals of color, when we reflect on previous generations, so our parents, our grandparents, in many cases, there was still a tremendous degree of stress, but there may not have been, number one, an opportunity or place to share it. And number two, the vocabulary with which to communicate that. And even number three, the sense that it was something that was worth discussing or sharing. Like, I think attitudes have shifted among the generations. So when you say we're seeing more millennials and Gen Z people reporting mental health concerns, I don't necessarily think that previous generations weren't having some similar experiences. It's just now we have a language. Now we're normalizing discussing it. And we're just in a different space generationally. So I wanted to share that. But what was your question? Because I was like, listen, like, oh, that's interesting. Huh. But when I think about my mom and my dad, I'm like, they were definitely, dealing with stress and pressure. It's just, it wasn't something that you complained about or even put a name to, at least culturally within our community. You just kind of kept it moving. And that's actually one of the things that I'm seeing a lot with the people I've been interviewing is like when you're reared by people with that mentality, you can be really hard on yourself. And you don't necessarily think that you have anything that's worth complaining about. So
Sure. I love your point about vocabulary because I think that rings so true. Like mental health issues are not brand new. It's just we're recognizing them in new ways. Um, and we're helping kids grow up with this kind of understanding of it. I think like a month ago, one of my friends texted me a picture of his daughter's like elementary school schedule for the week, and it was Mental Health Awareness Week. And on Wednesday, they were going to go wear green and go on a nature walk and eat a healthy snack. And
amazing.
right, we didn't have that as kids, and that's the kind of thing that makes me optimistic. So we started with the state of play. Let's just talk. Things are maybe not great, maybe getting better. What do you think is the biggest area for improvement when it comes to mental health generally and in the workplace?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly because I think, Dennis, you mentioned something that I've been thinking a lot about in preparation for this conversation. And really, you use the word time. That to me is the biggest issue that is kind of where all of these mental health issues coalesce around. So essentially, in terms of opportunity, I think we have to keep in mind that psychological health and mental health in many instances it's a byproduct of other factors that we may or may not have control for. So a workplace cannot dictate a person's health or what's going on with their family, but they can dictate how flexible is this workplace going to be? How much PTO are we offering? Are we encouraging mental health days? Are we encouraging sabbaticals? Are we observing employees' boundaries around their time? Are we emailing them late at night and expecting a response? And so I think it all kind of comes down to like how much margin are you encouraging through the practices that you're implementing within your organization? Because at the end of the day, the mental health issues are going to pop up for pretty much everyone. I think we lose that ability to cope when we just don't have enough margin in our lives to address the things that are coming up for us.
Dennis, where do you think we are on improvements?
I agree with what Amanda is saying. I think that the greatest opportunities that we have for improvements are at the systemic structural level. And what I mean by that is take a a hypothetical workplace. In a hypothetical workplace, could do some things to improve mental health that are structural and organizational, like Amanda was referring to, in terms of evaluating the amount of PTO that's being offered, evaluating the culture surrounding when you're expected to respond to email, these kinds of big cultural changes, which I think of as being kind of these systemic or organizational changes. They can also do changes like make an app available that helps people facilitate mindfulness practice. That's a good thing to do too, but I don't think that moves the needle the way these big organizational changes move the needle. So I want to see both of those kinds of approaches happening, but I think it's the systemic changes that really are going to move the needle and free up this space that Amanda's referring to that we all need to have. And sometimes that space isn't reflected in the actual technical details of how many days of PTO we get at our employer. If every time we're on PTO, we feel guilty for not checking our email, or we're consistently worried about who's doing my work while I'm gone, that sort of thing. So, building those structures and systems is just key to really helping people.
I think that's a really great transition to this next point, where there are a lot of people who still don't understand why we need to even talk about mental health in the workplace. So, Dennis, can you walk us through the impact of mental health on workplace performance and employee satisfaction? And effectively, what's the business case for why employees should prioritize employees' mental health? Excuse me, why companies should prioritize employees' mental health?
Well, I think that the business case is that it is part of the current competitive landscape. So, I think of three factors in particular, which are talent retention, talent attraction, and innovation. And so it's not as if there is currently some government agency that's telling employers you have to provide an app to all of your employees or else you're not in compliance with the law. But the competitive landscape is becoming such that if you want to retain the best talent, then you need to start doing these kinds of things. And if you want to attract the best talent, you need to start doing these kinds of things. And again, I'm not talking, I mentioned an app just now, but I'm not talking just about those smaller efforts that sort of encourage people to take time to better themselves, but also bettering the organization itself and bettering its systems, bettering its culture. Doing those things are just part of the competitive landscape to attract and retain the best people. Plus, it goes to innovation. There are countless studies at this point that show that psychological safety, which is a very distinct term of art within the psychological science, but that psychological safety, which is basically the ability of a small team to share ideas and to be themselves and to take chances and risks while at work, that as that goes up, innovation increases. And we are in a world right now where innovation is everything, and you've got to be innovating every day to stay competitive. So there may be some employers who say, why is it up to me to take care of the mental health of my employees? That should be my employees' problem. They should deal with that on their off time. Well, fine, but it's part of the competitive landscape. And if you're going to shy away from competition, then maybe you shouldn't be a business owner. And right now, being a business owner means you need to be in this game.
Sure. And that's such a great point, because why would people take risks at work if they don't feel like they're safe to do so?
Right.
Amanda, I know you touched on burnout a little bit earlier, but would love to hear more from you on the kind of things that impact employee well-being at work and the things that lead to burnout.
So basically, I believe that all burnout can be attributed to both workplaces and people themselves we're treating ourselves like machines instead of human beings. We have expectations of human beings that we should have for machines. And so I think, we spoke to that culture of overwork that's been normalized, especially in this country. I think the longer hours and just expecting unsustainable results from people who need, they just need more. And so I think you see that in terms of, the toxic normalization of putting work over everything, even your family, even your health. And so all of these things have become a part of the culture. And Dennis, you spoke to the need to really improve workplace cultures. Because all of these ideas have become so embedded in the fabric of work that when you voice that you're tired or this is too much, it's almost like you're an outlier. And we're beginning to see that change a bit, thankfully.
That also goes back to Nessa's point about psychological safety. There's certainly a connection there. Now, we often point to the pandemic as this catalyst for bringing conversations about mental health into the workplace. Dennis, can you talk a little bit about how the transition to remote or hybrid working models has affected mental health of employees? And then how have companies responded to that shift?
Sure. I mean, I think that the mental health as an issue has existed for a very long time. And this goes to the point that Amanda was making before. I mean, you talked to earlier generations and just in terms of the stresses that they had to deal with due to the technologies that we have now, they didn't have them and so forth. It's very difficult. But it was not talked about as much. Then the pandemic comes along and it shines a light on these issues. And a lot of companies, a lot of CEOs kind of go into triage mode and they say, oh wow, I'm seeing this now. We've got to do something about this. And the pandemic is here. And so, as of this Thursday, mental health is going to be important around this company. And that's how it's going to be. And that's great, and I applaud the CEOs for doing that. But that was an emergency response. Now we're past the pandemic, and so we're really at this fork in the road of are we going to implement forever solutions now, or is the emergency over and everything's just going to go back to the way it used to be? And CEOs have to get back to their regular jobs. They can't continue paying attention to just this issue, which means that systems need to be put in place to carry this forward. And I see wide variability across organizations and employers and whether that's being done and how it's being done. And you see it playing out in the headlines with some companies saying everybody's got to be back at work and other companies saying, no, we're going to continue to work remotely and so on and so forth. And, on the remote work, I don't think that there is one solution that applies to everybody, but I do think that we need to have rational solutions that make sense for any particular position. So I think where things go wrong is when a company leader orders people back to work for no good reason. If you have a job where you need to be there, then and it makes sense, then I think people understand that, and it's not as nearly as much of a problem. So sort of this whole notion of again the culture change, including employees and the workforce in the decisions surrounding these kinds of changes to the workplace, and making sure that everybody has a voice in that.
Amanda, I know this is your current big project with the book you're writing on. Anything to add in terms of the pandemic transition?
I mean, as Dennis said, I think so many people were experiencing many of the same things at the same time. And so, our voices created this chorus that just grew louder and louder. And I think, we saw something similar along the lines of calls for better parental leave policies or better policies for working parents. The work places have been moving at this unsustainable pace, but the pandemic allowed everyone who was kind of experiencing these different pockets of insustainability the chance to say, hey, I'm going through this, you're going through this too. Hey, wait a minute. Like, and normalizing it, right? Like, I'm not the only one. It's not just me. Something needs to change because this isn't working for a lot of people.
Dennis, I know you mentioned there's not one size fits all approach that works for this, but any views on how other countries have done this better and what lessons we can learn from them? This is a question from the audience, so thank you for that.
Sure. I think that Canada is one country that we can look to that has done a bit more than the US has in terms of thinking about mental health as part of the overall occupational safety conversation. And so in the US, we have OSHA, we have other agencies that regulate physical safety in the workplace. And when we think about workplace safety, that tends to be where our minds go. And that's really important. And thank goodness that we have regulations that, ensure that people wear hard hats and have steel-toed shoes and so on and so forth. But we are also increasingly transitioning to a knowledge and service economy. And those positions are not without their own risks and dangers, but the risks and dangers are different, and they're not necessarily the same physical kinds of risks and dangers. They sometimes may be risks and dangers to our emotional and psychological well-being. I do think that Canada has done a little more in terms of recognizing those facts and building some of that into their regulatory schemes than the United States has. So that's one country in particular that we can look to.
I definitely want to dig more into the difference between physical and mental illnesses. And so I'm glad you brought that up there. So how companies prioritize mental health and whether employees feel comfortable talking about it was something that I was really prioritizing when I was searching for my next role. And I even asked about it in my interviews, which was a little atypical, but it was important to me. And I loved hearing from Invariant's chief people officer about how the firm navigates employee burnout and the fact that Invariant has an employee assistance program that provides staff with counseling sessions if they need them. And actually, mental health even came up with a few members of staff when I was interviewing, which made me feel at home and like this was a culture I'd become a part of. So that factored into my decision to come here. And obviously, we're having this conversation now, which is amazing. But I'm curious, Dennis, and demand to both of you, what do employees and prospective employees expect from their workplaces regarding mental health in terms of support and benefits?
Well, I think that when we just look at our APA survey data as an example, what we see is that when asked in the abstract, employees say that they want to work for companies that respect their psychological and emotional well-being, and that mental health benefits would be an important factor in their decision-making if they were looking for a new position. So sort of in the abstract, when somebody's sitting comfortably looking at their computer screen, answering a survey, these things matter a lot. I think that then we need to start really looking at the disconnect between what people say they believe on the one hand and what they're willing to express in any particular workplace, though.
Sure.
And there's, again, just a tremendous amount of variability where there are workplaces, and you've described one that you're in, where you feel comfortable having these conversations. There are many, many workplaces, however, where people do not feel comfortable having those kinds of conversations. And I'm hesitant to encourage someone to take too many risks in a workplace that I'm not involved in and that I don't know anything about, and could result in harm to their career. So it is a very delicate conversation to try to address, but an extremely important one. And I think that the more proactive that employers can be about raising these issues, the easier it makes it for employees. And if employers really don't have a problem with talking about this, then you need to make that known. And that can take a lot of different forms. It can take the form of Many companies have, you know, a weekly or even daily email newsletter, including something in there all the time about here's the EAP benefits and here's the number you call, or here's tips on taking care of your mental health or this or that, can really begin to shift the culture and send the right message.
That's great. I remember we had a staff meeting on 9/11 a few months ago, and the head of our HR reminded us that it's a difficult day for some people, particularly in DC, and we have an employee assistance program, and reminded us of the benefits. And a lot of people didn't know about it. And that was such a great example of getting our benefits that we have in front of people who might want to use them.
I think the benefits are a big draw, and I think they're great. I don't know that many of the people I work with are expecting specific benefits or desiring specific benefits per se. Like, it's a nice to have. I think what they're looking for is kind of how I was discussing mental health as being this byproduct, or good mental health being a byproduct of other factors that workplaces can actually control for. So, again, going back to how are you observing your employees' boundaries? Are you compensating them fairly? Is there a wide disparity between what people of, the same level of experience and capability are being paid? Do people feel safe to add their contributions? Do they feel valued? So I think the culture of the organization really contributes to at least the workplace's role in an employee's mental health, more so than, are they giving me a benefit so that I can go and hire a therapist? It's like, if we can kind of remove the need for, or at least the workplace's contribution to my need for the therapy, that's what the employees that I'm talking to want more than anything.
Yeah. Can you talk more about what managers can do to create that kind of culture?
I think on the one hand, building a sense of trust, right? Like, if I feel like you care about me, and this goes back to treating
Yeah.
people like human beings versus machines. I feel like you care about me. I feel like you are a champion for my work. You want me to do a great job. You value me as a person. Then I'm going to feel safe enough to potentially come to you when I'm having a challenge, because I trust you as a person. It's like the same things that we look to in our personal relationships to dictate whether or not we're going to share, or we're going to, be vulnerable. I think workplaces have to understand that you're dealing with people.
Mhm.
So that's one piece. I think what you mentioned before about including messaging, on the website, or in conversations, and even promoting events like this one, go a long way in expressing to employees that mental health is not a topic that we shy away from. It's not
Mhm.
something that, we're afraid of. We're normalizing it. You're human. We're dealing with it too. I think managers can role model that conversation by even talking about their own mental health, or at least
Yeah.
bringing the conversation up first.
Yeah.
So yeah, those would be my points.
So true. Dennis, I've heard you use the phrase coping to flourishing before. Can you talk about which strategies can be implemented to reduce workplace stressors and create a more mentally healthy work environment so employees can actually flourish?
Sure. I think that one important concept is psychological safety, which I referred to before. And psychological safety is interesting because that term, psychological safety, sounds like a term that you wouldn't need to read anything about in order to understand what it means, because it sounds like it must mean the same thing as physical safety, except it has something to do with our brains and our emotions. But actually, psychological safety, the way it's used in the scientific literature, it's a very narrow concept that, as we talked about before, refers to your ability to feel safe in terms of expressing yourself at work and making your unique contribution to the team, not feeling that you're going to potentially be stabbed in the back by your coworkers or undercut, these kinds of things. So fostering that psychological safety is one really important step. I think another one, and this goes back to what you and Amanda were just discussing, is managers. And there's increasingly data coming out showing just how meaningful that manager and reporting line relationship is in a person's life, to the extent that your relationship with your direct manager can have nearly as much influence on your well-being as your relationship with your spouse or your relationship with your very best friend. So I think it is critical at the outset for managers to understand that, to
Yeah.
know that they can have that kind of impact on people's lives. Because just knowing that alone can help people kind of put the brakes on a little bit and think about, oh, okay, well, the next thing I say may really matter to this person. And so I'm going to be careful about what I say. And we can't count on everyone to be the best people person in the world. And so we can, though, count on people to learn. And so manager training on mental health awareness, I think, is just critical. And we don't see a lot of it right now. But imagine a world, 15 years ago, we didn't see a lot of HR training on harassment in the workplace.
Sure.
Now it's commonplace. Everybody goes through harassment training in the workplace. I hope that 5 years from now, every manager will go through mental health awareness training as part of their workplace HR system, so that we can kind of elevate that understanding and put people in a better position, give them the tools to do well.
Yeah, I think a lot of times too, people are scared of how to have conversations about mental health, even outside the workplace, just because it's a new topic that we're still getting comfortable discussing. But in theory, it should be something that we're just as comfortable discussing as a physical illness. Like we should be just as comfortable talking about a physical illness as a migraine, but that's very different in practice. And it's common for someone to say, hey, I have a fever, I have a headache, I'm going to go home for the day and recharge. But I recently experienced this personally. I had a panic attack during the workday and I had a choice to make. I was thinking, do I say I'm not feeling well and go home, or do I be a little more candid about what's actually going on with me? So I like plucked up the courage. I told my manager what was going on, and it took a while for me to come up with the right balance of words, but I'm glad I did because they were so, excuse me, they were so understanding, and I feel like it fostered like a healthy workplace dynamic. So, what advice can you give to people for how to communicate their mental health needs to their managers? We've got the top-down manager down to employee, but what advice do you give for the other way?
So I think what you just mentioned is so great. You took a beat and you thought about your words and you said you mustered the courage. But I think another thing that must have been at play there was that sense of safety and trust that your manager had already fostered and invested in you. And so I like to say that and kind of align with Dennis on every workplace is not the same and every manager is not the same. And I think you need to proceed with caution in determining how much you want to divulge. And it depends on your individual relationship with the people in your workspace. But I think if you do feel safe, first normalize it with yourself. So just as you said, our mental health is an aspect of our health, just like anything else. And you wouldn't be expected to sit there with a migraine or, a sprained ankle and not seek out support. You can't focus if you're in pain.
Oh yeah.
You can't be productive. And so I think once we normalize that, I think a lot of times as employees, you might even see your mental health as something that you have to push through and deal with on your own, but it is a part of the full picture of your health. And if it is, keeping you from the actual role, the work of your role, then it's definitely, I think, something that you should speak up about. So I think, again, if you have the safety and you have that sense of trust, you can try your hand at being candid as you were, and I think you'll find that it builds that relationship. However, I would like to say that everyone isn't in that situation, and I think if you acknowledge that you're struggling with your mental health and you need to take some time, you don't necessarily have to be specific about what you're taking that time for.
Sure.
If you are sick, you are sick. So if you don't feel comfortable divulging all the details, that's fair. And I also think that we need to normalize on both sides that people have differing levels of comfort and differing levels of privacy when it comes to all of their health, not just mental health. Some people wouldn't tell you if they were going in to have surgery for a hysterectomy or, if they had a cancer diagnosis. So I think we have to understand that we're dealing with people and every person is different. And so normalizing that even if a person feels safe, they may not personally be someone who's going to divulge a ton of details, and that's okay.
Mhm. And I like what you said about the need for trust on this and the need for safety. And that seems like um, something that managers can really help instill. So, Dennis, I'd love to pick your brain. Here's another question from the audience. Thank you all for continuing to send these in. Is how do we make company leaders recognize the need for leadership development and the kind of training for managers to learn more about mental health issues, how to develop them, and see it as a priority?
I think that one way is for employees to be talking about it, and just having the conversation kind of circulating around the workplace, especially when employees are able to talk about, our competitor is doing this and we're not doing this. And I'm not sure why that is. Once you kind of put that competitive notion into the business space, sometimes that can really take hold and lead to some changes. There's also data out there that show that manager training can have really positive effects. And it is interesting because it has the positive effect both on the manager who goes through the training. It also has the positive effect on employees reporting to that manager, even in experiments where the employee reporting to that manager was blind, was not told that the manager was going through this. We can't attribute that to some kind of subjective, oh, well, it must be better because my manager went through this training. They don't know that that's happening, yet their subjective scores on their self-reported well-being are going up when their manager is receiving this kind of training. So there's hard data out there to support the effectiveness of these kinds of things.
I so appreciate how much you've been backing all of this up with data, and glad that there is this much research going into mental health writ large. So a question for both of you, if we can get more into the tactical advice for practical advice for individuals, is how can employees take an active role in promoting their own mental well-being at work? And more specifically, what can they be doing to improve their mental health in general?
I encourage all of my clients and just everyone that I meet to get intentional about developing practices that work for you. Everyone is different, but I think wellness and self-care practices that allow you to still your mind, to reflect, process, metabolize the experiences of your life are extraordinarily helpful. So the same way we understand that if we want good cardiovascular health, it's up to us to get the cardio in, to get on the Peloton, take a walk, take a run, etc. I think we also need to begin taking a bit of that mental wellness and well-being, the responsibility of that, and operationalizing our schedules around it. So a few things from my personal toolkit: journaling daily, love it. Meditation, I recently started integrating sound baths into that. And you can do it very quickly. It could be 5 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on how much time you have. Meditation, obviously, exercising, prayer, whatever works for you. I think however you can find a daily practice of 15 to 30 minutes where you're getting quiet, getting centered. Breath work, another huge thing. Breathing. Like, how many of us aren't even breathing? I think what you'll find is once you invest in that practice, you start to see the dividends when you go through a stressful situation and you've been, putting deposits into that account. You have better coping ability. And so I think that's definitely something I would encourage everyone to do. And obviously, if you're dealing with an acute crisis, therapy, see a doctor, but everyone should be maintaining that sense of well-being through a practice that works best for them. So identify that and get intentional.
Dennis, anything to add?
I agree with everything Amanda just said. I mean, there have been many times throughout this hour I've wanted to stand up and applaud when Amanda stops talking because she's just. I agree with everything she's saying. I think that her point about it needs to be specific to the person too is really important. For some people, introducing meditation is not going to help them. That just makes them feel strange, but they really like fishing. And fishing gives them that time to settle the mind and have that quiet time. And that may be the solution for them. But it's still something you have to be intentional about to carve out that time and really go and do it and make the space in your head. I also think that sometimes it's easy to answer what can we do for our own mental health, but it's just as important to ask, what can I do for the mental health of my friends and coworkers? And so a lot of it is not just about what am I doing for me, but what am I doing for the person who works in the office next to me?
Yeah.
And what am I doing for the people who report to me? Am I sending them emails at midnight, or am I being respectful and holding those back and sending to them at appropriate times? These kinds of things, when you really start getting intentional about how you're treating others, it helps you to get intentional about how you treat yourself as well.
Such a little thing, but something I just love to do is asking someone in the workplace, particularly junior staff, how are you? And then stop and allow them to answer. If they want to give you I'm doing great, had a fun weekend, great. If they want to take the opportunity to tell you, actually, I'm really struggling and don't have a lot of bandwidth, great. You're giving them that option, but it's just like the pausing to allow them to express themselves and maybe use it as an opportunity to talk about their own mental health. And when people do that to me too, I really appreciate it. Okay, so we really can't have a conversation about psychological health and well-being without acknowledging the unique challenges of minorities and people of color. Amanda, can you talk a little bit about the specific factors that impact mental health of minorities differently than the general population?
I think when you're thinking about any minority or racial minority, or even when we think about gender or sexual orientation, there are, studies have shown that, we are dealing with disparities. And I can speak specifically to African Americans, higher health disparities, housing discrimination, pay inequity. Like, we have all of these different, women's equal pay day, Black women's equal pay day, Hispanic women's equal pay day, because we're all not being compensated the same equitably and fairly. And so when you look at all of these experiences that are kind of layered on top of the general stresses of everyday life, it's almost like health comorbidities, right? Everyone is at risk for potentially catching the flu or catching COVID, but we pay special attention to someone who's asthmatic or someone who maybe is immunocompromised because they can't necessarily withstand the virus the same way, because their bodies are already dealing with other things. And so that's kind of how I see navigating racism, sexism, or even discrimination around your sexual orientation. It is it's impacting your mental health because it's just a whole different set of challenges that you're having to deal with. And the more intersectional that gets, so you may be Black, but also you may also be bisexual or queer, and you may also be a woman. Like, each
Yeah.
layer of identity can compound depending on your environment.
Dennis, can you talk how that intersectionality impacts their experience, their mental wellness in the workplace?
Sure. I mean, I think that Amanda makes a good analogy by talking about comorbidities. And when you have these intersectionalities coming into play in the workplace, and one of the places, looking again at our APA Work in America data, and some of this is unpublished data, where we see the intersectionality with people who are living with disability and also are in one of these other groups. It really takes a toll. And so disability is something that I think we have not done enough in the workplace to address. The data on these topics is often disturbing. People expressing that they're experiencing bullying in the workplace as a result of a visible disability. I mean, just completely unacceptable behavior that you hear about and you think that can that possibly be happening? And it is. And when you combine that with these other factors, these other comorbidities, to borrow that analogy, it can really have a devastating impact. And what makes it so difficult is that as you put these multiple factors together, you reduce the number of people who have that combination, just sort of as a statistical reality. And so then it becomes more difficult to study that. And unfortunately, it becomes easier for society to overlook it because there are not as many people who have all of these factors coming together. But we really have to pay attention to it.
I love that term too. Comorbidities definitely seems relevant here. So we're nearing the end of our session, so I want to zoom out a little bit. I'd love to hear from both of you on this and sharing what are some key lessons and key observations you've made from your time working in the mental health arena with your own mental wellness or things you've observed.
I would say one of the things that I've noticed is that we're all having so many of the same experiences and challenges. And I think, there was a time when you did not discuss your mental health. And I'm so happy to see that shifting and changing because it's giving people an opportunity to share, connect, reduce stigma around challenges to mental health. And I think when you reduce stigma, you also lessen any shame that a person may feel. And I mean, oftentimes like shame can even compound the mental
Yeah.
health challenges. So I think at least what I've seen is getting more transparent and being willing to share and talk about it does as much for you personally when you're struggling with your mental health as it does for other people who may be experiencing the same thing. And it gives them a sense of comfort and courage and connection to know that this is not something that's wrong with me. It's something that many different people are experiencing as well. So that's what I've noticed. I'll let you share this before we talk about things that people should be doing.
And I too have a very positive and optimistic sense about how the conversation is becoming more prevalent. And I just think that is a great thing, and I think it's something that is important, not just for people who are experiencing a struggle at a particular point in time, but for everybody, because everybody's going to experience the struggle at some point in time. And going back to kind of that expansive definition of mental health, we need to really be thinking about this as more than the elimination of mental illness, but instead really getting to the point where we're all achieving the highest level of psychological functioning that we can possibly achieve. And that's going to make all of us feel better. It's going to make us more innovative. It's going to make the workplace better. It's just going to do all kinds of good things. And so striving for that, I mean, I can't think of what would be a more worthy goal.
Those are both such great answers. So we haven't talked about social media yet. So let's just touch on that quickly before we wrap. There's so much information that we're being fed between news and social media that it's just impossible to unplug these days. Are you all seeing more around burnout and decision fatigue and anxiety due to tech, internet, social media? And how do you recommend people recharge in the digital age when our jobs are on the computer all day? You got the big screen, the small screen, the medium screen.
Right. I would definitely say that I've seen an increase in burnout due to social media. I even wrote an article about social media burnout. I think that the onus is really on you to, again, invest in yourself through these wellness practices. And sometimes that means stepping away from your devices. If you are on your computer, obviously for work, it's up to you also just to limit the apps that you may have on your desktop or notifications that are pinging. I mean, even going so far as to adopt like some of the strategies from was a 5-hour work week of, okay, I'm going to check my email. I'm not going to check my email every time there's a notification. I'm going to turn that off and maybe designate a few times each day that I'm checking email, and even include that information in my autoresponder to let people know when I can be responsive. So I think that we are at a point where we can see definitely the negative impacts of being online, both and then when you think about kids and young people, the comparison, it's damaging them from another, not just the screen time, but also just the constant comparison of your life experiences to someone else's highlight reel. And
Yeah.
so I think we just have to be mindful about taking those breaks, both for our physical health, but also from our screens.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that there's a tremendous amount of personal responsibility that we all need to be taking with regard to social media. And then when you expand the conversation more broadly to technology in general, I think that workplaces are playing or should be playing a role there as well. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing in our most recent survey data is, perhaps not surprisingly, a huge uptick in worry about artificial intelligence. People who are worried that 5 years from now, their job's going to be gone because it's going to be taken over by artificial intelligence. Is that a legitimate worry? I don't know, but employers need to be having the conversation and either saying, no, that's not a legitimate worry. We have no plans of doing that, or having a legitimate and transparent conversation of, yeah, you should be worried. And so let's talk about getting you into some other
Sure.
training programs and what else you could be doing for us.
Mhm. Now, I want to close by looking ahead. What emerging trends do you all see when it comes to workplace mental health, and how should organizations prepare to address them?
So for me, it goes back to that concept of margin and time. I've been really encouraged to see more companies adopting remote work, um, keeping remote work, or at least a flexible working arrangement, as well as introducing employee sabbaticals and just intentional times for people to take a break and rest. And I think for me, that is the biggest factor, is acknowledging and making space for human beings to be human.
Mhm.
Giving them extra time to deal with the challenges that life will inevitably present. And so that's what I'm excited about seeing. I have seen obviously a lot of return to office mandates that in many cases are unnecessary. So I'm hoping that we can hold the line and
Sure.
keep things going back. But I think the biggest investments to employee time flexibility and time off are the things I'm excited about the most.
Yep, respect for time off and respect for flexibility are huge. And it is the big organizational systemic level changes that are really going to have impact. It's not the tiny things around the margins. And cultural and systemic organizational changes only happen when you give the leaders of those organizations the tools to make it happen, which means manager training. And so I just can't emphasize enough that getting managers to not only buy into these ideas, but to have the tools not to become a therapist, not to do things that they're not qualified to do, but to effectively manage people is just really critical.
Great way to close. All right, well, we've come to the end of our Dialogue for Change. Thank you all for your attendance, and a special thank you to each of our panelists for today's discussion. Please look for follow-up emails from Invariant for more details about the Dialogue for Change speaker series and for additional diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging resources. You can also find us on X at Invariant and on LinkedIn. Thank you again for joining us.